to the emergency COVID standard for Virginia call. You all have heard reports of this development through the Department of Labor's Safety and Health Codes Board. It is now a completed rule, emergency standard for COVID for the workplace. It's about a 30-page single-space set of regulations. What our goal today is to give you a high-level overview, of the standard, to give you the clear timeline of compliance on the disease prevention and mitigation plan and your employee training mandate, and an estimate of when we think that trigger will start based upon the publication of the final rule. So we want to give you all that information today and answer any questions we can at a very high level. I am going to have to bounce off the call and join back in at the very end. I've got a personal commitment that I can't get out of. My wife is having knee replacement today, so I'm literally at the hospital trying to double duty here, so I appreciate everybody's patience. But you're in very good hands. We've got Courtney Malveaux. Courtney is the former Commissioner of Labor and Industry for the Commonwealth under a previous administration. Courtney is also a member of the Safety and Health Codes Board and was front and center through this entire process. In fact, he was the lead in representing the business community on this board. I can say definitively, after sitting through nearly 40 hours of hearings remotely, because of course the administration and this board barred a historic precedent, barred public participation. Never seen this before, ever. I know it's an emergency rule, but there are a couple of things that really shocked us, that this administration, how far they were willing to go to pass these rules as they had been developed and presented by the AFL-CIO and their proxies at the federal level, and had almost 2 months had it in their hands working it before they even held these hearings. And so we're terribly disappointed with the process, shocked at the lack of allowance for public participation and public testimony being barred from the hearings themselves. We know that 98% of the business community has no idea what's coming at them and what they're going to have to do to comply. But all of that said, I feel incredibly grateful for Courtney and what he did in trying to represent the interests of the Virginia business community broadly, but particularly manufacturers, in carrying our comments forward throughout the entire process and really being dogged about it in light of a completely stacked board. It was a very biased board process. It was, in our opinion, very little debate, and that was not created by Courtney primarily, asking a lot of hard questions. And I think the outcome would have been far worse had Courtney not been present. I can assure you it would have been far worse. But that being said, we do have to comply. It is a temporary standard for up to 6 months. And then the last thing I'll say is the importance of why this is. There's a lot of misinformation that somehow if you comply with CDC or OSHA, you're exempt from this. That is a falsehood. And we'll explain why the language is so trickily worded and why we need to pay attention to this. And so we'll walk through all that today. You'll get this high-level overview. Courtney will answer questions, and then I'll pop back in the end, and I've got some more information later. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Courtney Malveaux. And Courtney, thank you so much. He's with Jackson Lewis and is an associate member of the VMA, and he is also he is legal counsel to our safety subcommittee. So Courtney, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brett. And Kimberly, can you hear me? Brett, can you all hear me?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Thanks for your kind words, Brett. And honestly, I just sat on the board and raised the questions that I thought needed to be raised, whether they were difficult questions for them or otherwise. I thought it really did need to be brought up. And unfortunately, the Safety and Health Codes Board did enact an emergency standard that did not provide for input from the business community or from the manufacturing community, important stakeholders. And so while I did raise quite a few concerns, and I can't say that I'm in agreement with all the provisions in it or necessarily in having the standard. Please don't shoot the messenger. I'm just kind of wearing my lawyer hat now and just letting you know what's in it so that we can be ready for it because it's coming quickly. And so if we take a breath and are ready for it, then we'll be okay. So Kim, could you go ahead and advance the slide? Great, thanks. And that's okay. So here's what I'd like to cover with you is just a quick background on the new standard that's come into place, the time frame as Brett mentioned, and I'd like to talk about what are the requirements for all employers. And then there are employers that it breaks it down for low hazard, medium hazard, high hazard employers. And so I'd like to go ahead and address what those requirements are. I think most of the folks on this meeting will be either low hazard or medium hazard. And so the more exotic things that are required for first responders probably won't apply, and I'll just kind of skim over that. Kim, could you go ahead and advance for me? So quick primer. This is a background on the emergency temporary standard. Go ahead and advance for me. Quick primer. So Virginia, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, governs workplace safety and health nationally. In half the states may operate what's called a state plan. And so that's a situation where the state is kind of deputized to run its own program. And so we're one of those states. And so we're allowed under a grant to do our own OSHA in Virginia, or Virginia Occupational Safety and Health, or VOSH. And as Brett mentioned, I used to serve as labor commissioner, so I oversee VOSH and its enforcement of our OSHA requirements. And so Virginia also may have additional requirements to federal OSHA, and that's what we have here in front of us today. It covers all state and local employees, and it also covers nearly all private employers. It does not cover federal employers like federal agencies. It does not cover the military, and it may not generally cover employers that work at federal work sites. So it doesn't have that kind of jurisdiction. But by and large, just about everyone on this in this meeting probably will fall under VOSH jurisdiction. Kim, could you advance for me? So it's the California usually leads the way in passing regulations. We've had the question asked, is Virginia the new California? And Brett and others have fought the valiant fight, the good fight for manufacturing and for employers in the business community with the General Assembly to try to keep Virginia from becoming another California in terms of being overly regulatory and overly business unfriendly. And so this is a case where we actually have not only matched what California does, but exceeded. So Virginia jumped out and became the first state to pass a standard addressing COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus. And so in doing so, the Safety and Health Codes Board, on which I sit, passed it. It was a split vote. I actually opposed many of its provisions, and in disclosure, I did oppose the way it was done without input from the business community, and I was not in was not in favor of a specific standard because I think that many of you and many employers have been working very well and diligently in using the guidance coming from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, from OSHA, from National Association of Manufacturers and VMA, and other organizations and we've been encompassing those best practices into our workplaces. And so, in my view, it was not necessary, but I'm going to take off my board member hat and put on my lawyer hat and just kind of talk a little bit more about what's in it. So, it came about because you may have seen that the governor has issued multiple executive orders and issued a state of emergency in dealing with COVID. And so this was the agency's response to that, and also in response to complaints of COVID being present in some meat packing or meat processing and poultry facilities. And then the governor determined that we should have a standard that would apply to all workplaces. And that's where we are with this standard. It's an emergency temporary standard. And so it lasts for 6 months. It will become effective a day after it is published in a newspaper. Yes, we're still doing that. That will probably happen next week, and then the following day will become effective. I don't know the exact date yet. I'm trying to stay on top of that. I just check in with the agency website, check in with me, check in with BMA, and we're trying to keep tabs on that. But expect it to be effective by the end of the month. So it will remain effective for 6 months. So probably around late January is when it would expire. It may also expire if the governor withdraws the state of emergency. And actually that's a provision I added in there to say that we shouldn't have this emergency standard if the emergency isn't there. So we actually did succeed in getting that as an additional sunset if that were to occur. If it does not, then the board, I do expect, will proceed with looking at a permanent standard. And it may be a broader one with respect to infectious diseases generally, and not just COVID-19. And so I did support provisions to require stakeholder input. And so there will be more meaningful discussion if we do proceed with the permanent standard, and I hope that the board and the administration will be listening to you if it does proceed in that manner. So that's where we are, and glad to answer any questions. Kim, could you advance for me, please? So let's just talk about what is in it. And Brett mentioned it's over 30 pages. It's a little complicated. And Kim, if you could advance for me, a lot of the provisions, it was not. There are provisions in there that are not entirely clear, and so if it's a little frustrating or a little confusing or a little convoluted, I understand, but it's not really drafted in a way that is entirely. It could use some improvement, but it's like the legislative process. It's the culmination. It's just what a bunch of different individuals and interests kind of put together into this. So the watchword for me and for you, I think, is common sense. And so if we're focusing on trying to take care of safety in a way that makes sense for your workplace, you're not going to go wrong. So there are a lot of requirements here, and a lot of them do exceed CDC and OSHA requirements, and they're specific to Virginia. But if you just kind of keep in front of you the thought that we're trying to make the workplace safer with COVID, just keeping that big picture in mind is very important, I think. So the way the standard is broken down, it categorizes businesses as being low hazard places of employment, medium hazard, high, and very high. And so it also includes some policies and procedures for employees to, it requires that you develop policies and procedures for employees to report COVID symptoms to employers. It also prohibits the continued work or the entry of employees who have known cases of positive COVID tests or suspected because of symptoms. It does require employers to encourage flexible sick leave policies. Again, now that's a very vague term. We know what the requirements are under the Federal Medical Leave Act, Family and Medical Leave Act. We know the requirements under the Families First Coronavirus Recovery Act. FFCRA. We don't know what flexible means what in this context, but many employers who are trying to use best practices and trying to keep their workplace going open, but also try to accommodate employees who can't come to work for a period of time, maybe because they're quarantined or they have a positive test. Showing some flexibility is really, I think, what the agency is going for. How this will be implemented, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. I don't think the agency knows. But that I just want you should know that that language is in there. Employers do have to have a system to report positive tests within the past 14 days. And this applies not only to employees, but also to subcontractors. This requirement, everyone's become familiar since this past winter about requirement to wash hands 20 seconds, etc. Hand sanitizer is added on as an additional requirement at all places of employment. And so it's whenever feasible, and I at least frankly was able to get the agency to add the feasibility language so that if we do have another mass shortage of hand sanitizer, you can't get it, that there should be an out. If you can't get it, you can't get it, and you're doing the best you can. And so the agency does come from a standpoint of wanting to work with employers in terms of the hand sanitizer requirement, and that is above and beyond what the federal guidance provides. And so there's a requirement that employers would assess the risk levels of employees and also suppliers before entry. There are not particulars on that. It's difficult to determine how that would happen. There is some thought in terms of are they coming from COVID hotspots or more dangerous locations? But that is probably one where workability would be a problem for the agency. I do predict that happening. And also there's an additional requirement, not just of employers, but also owners of properties in which businesses operate. So if you have a building owner or the owner of a facility in which there are tenant employers in that property, then that owner does have a responsibility and requirement to notify those employers who are tenants of a positive COVID-19 test on that property. Kim, would you please advance for me? So there's another requirement that employers have to notify the Department of Health if you have a positive test. That is prospective. That's not retrospective. You don't have to look back and find all your positive tests and then fess up to Department of Health. Once it's effective, that's the point at which you start to report to the Department of Health. I had one suggestion. I haven't checked on this, but if I understand the Department of Health is not yet set up to receive these complaints online, and so, but if you do provide this notice in some way, I would encourage as a best practice to do so in some kind of written form, email. If the online system isn't working, we could go old school and use a fax machine, but I like to have at least some kind of a hard copy or at least notes indicating the date and time in which the notice was provided. And there was a suggestion that if their local departments of health are notified, if the Virginia Department of Health is not yet ready to receive that, we should try to at least achieve some kind of substantial compliance with this standard. I wish the system was actually developed, but the agencies are kind of scrambling right now to get this together. And the last time I checked, it wasn't together at this point. So my job is to make sure that you're not running afoul of the standard to the extent possible. So there is what I call the hotspot rule, and that is if you have 3 or more COVID positive tests within a 2-week period, then you have to report it to the Department of Labor and Industry, to Virginia Occupational Safety and Health. And so that is just like if you had amputation or a loss of eye or fatality or inpatient hospitalization, where we have to act. We don't just record it in a log, but we actually report it into the agency with a certain time frame. That does exist for COVID positive tests. There are hazard assessments that have to be done for job tasks. I don't think it has to be done for every single bullet point in a person's job description, but rather for general job duties. So I wouldn't get overly bureaucratic in pulling together Excel spreadsheets to put, various job functions in high, very high, medium, low hazard. But I would certainly at least try to develop groupings. If, for example, you have administrative personnel or executive personnel working in an office setting, those would probably fall under low. You could clump them together as that. You could probably, if you have a lot of traffic and a lot of people in close proximity to each other on a manufacturing floor, then that might be more of a medium hazard. You might clump them together that way. So there's also one of the triggers. Once we have the effective date, then that will trigger the 60-day time frame in which you will have to prepare an infectious disease preparedness and response plan. And I have a little bit more detail on that. The agency will provide some details on how to do that. So some other requirements, and I'm going to try to just do a quick flyby on this. But oh, Kim, could you advance for me, please? And there's a section 10 subsection G in the standard, and I'm sorry, that's not this part. There is a good faith point where if you are in actual compliance with CDC guidance, if you're providing equivalent or greater protection than this standard, then that would be considered good faith. That is not to say that if you're in compliance with CDC guidance that you're in compliance, as Brett said. So the language is worded a little tricky, and it actually moved to something more restrictive than even what the governor wanted. And so I will say I oppose this. I think that following CDC guidance is the best, are the best practices that are out there based on the best science that we have, as far as I can tell. But this standard, let's just say that if you follow everything CDC requires and suggests, both the mandatory language, you shall. Then you add in the suggestive language, you may, you should. And if you comply with all of that, if it is at least as protective as this standard, then you'll be in compliance. What does it mean? I don't think it means much. I think it means that really following the standard is pretty much the requirement here. So I would hate to have to litigate that point for you. I think just keeping an eye on this standard is an important part. So I do have a question that was raised. Does reporting to Department of Health create a double reporting of a positive case, since the testing site is reporting findings to VDH as well? I think so. And so this was this point was raised to me, and unfortunately this was kind of rushed through. There was no real input from stakeholders. So unfortunately, yes, I do think it was raised to my attention after that was enacted that it's probably duplicative. And so I'm hoping that the agency uses some reason on this and acknowledges that if the Department of Health already has a report of a COVID positive test, that a second report of the same test would not be required. But it doesn't make a lot of sense, unfortunately, but it's where we are. It's in the standard that that we have today So let's see. Another requirement, non-discrimination means anti-retaliation provisions. So you can't retaliate against an employee if they raise or report a concern. Unfortunately, there's language including reports on social media. And so there are employees who may go to Facebook or whatever, and Lord knows what they may say about their place of employment, whether it's true or not. And so there are some protections for reporting information about your employer there. That's very unfortunate. I oppose that vehemently, but I was not the majority on that issue. Certainly, they're reporting to the agency and reporting up your chain of command is protected activity. Always has been. You may not retaliate against employee if they voluntarily wish to use personal protective equipment that is not required, and also reasonable work refusals, and that's been in place already. And so and people can't leave work en masse and say, oh, we feel unsafe and we can go. They do have specific requirements. It has to be a reasonable refusal, and one in which they've tried the normal avenues of reporting it, and that didn't work. And they have essentially no other choice but to refuse to work. So I wouldn't read that to mean that people can just say, I feel unsafe, I'm not working. Doesn't work that way. Ken, would you advance for me?
Okay, so one of the questions had to do with the previous page, well, 2 previous pages ago, when you were talking about the reporting notion if you had 3 cases within 2 weeks. Are we talking recordable cases, meaning they sought help? Are we talking work-related cases, or are we talking, let's say the employee was even out of work for the past 3 weeks, sometime out of work, they developed COVID, or maybe even on a layoff situation, where do we need to report that case?
That's a great question. And the standard is not clear, so we'll back up and we'll take the previous law and then apply this new standard. In the previous law, you had to record work-related injuries and illnesses, including COVID. And there essentially is some requirement that employers try to do some diligence to determine whether it was something they caught at work, whether it's work-related. And that doesn't mean you have to do contact tracing. That's not a requirement. But if, for example, you have an employee who is working closely with 20 others and someone catches it and everyone else gets it around the same time, that probably is work-related. If, on the other hand, you have an isolated case, I was just with an employer yesterday. It was an isolated case 2 weeks ago. We don't have any positive cases since then. That probably wasn't work-related. So, and reporting the reporting requirement for illnesses that cause fatalities and inpatient hospitalization, they must be reported if they are work-related. COVID has this special rule and a different analysis. The work-related component, that requirement is not in this rule. And I'll go back and check again, but I don't recall seeing that in this rule at all. And so, and that certainly was not in the discussion. And I'll go back and reread. I've read it several times. I haven't seen that. So then your positive COVID cases must be reported to the agency if you have 3 or more in a 2-week period to Virginia Occupational Safety and Health. And so we're going to work through this. We'll have to see how the agency enforces and if it does so in a manner that makes sense. I'm sorry I can't give you the clearest answer, but that's how the law reads to me. Okay, so I'll go ahead and continue forward. Low hazard employers, the requirements are for everybody from low to high if you're in the low category. And so low hazard places of employment are those in which you don't expect to have required, as a part of your work duties, you're not required to have contact with people within 6 feet of someone with known or suspected cases. So that's generally like if they're office environment or they're working separate cubicles, those types of environments. If there's minimal contact to be expected with others, if there's minimal contact, you could achieve it through engineering or administrative controls. And so there you could have floor to ceiling barriers and telecommuting, or I think what they really meant was teleworking, stagger shifts and separating people by space, by time. And you're able to mandate social distancing, and whenever social distancing is impossible, face coverings. And this is separate and apart from the governor's executive orders, which supersede. If the governor says all of you will wear face coverings indoors, then that supersedes this standard. But so that's what low hazard is. Kim, could you advance for me, please? Just a quick comment. Unfortunately, the standard was passed with the science that was known at the time of the drafting. And so where you see, for example, if you have a barrier floor to ceiling like a wall, that that would be an effective barrier according to the science that we have known in the past. I read in the Washington Post that on Sunday that now we're finding that HVAC systems are flowing air, and that you can be on the entire side of a room or a different part of a building and catch it because aerosol particles are spreading through the HVAC system. So unfortunately, we are now in a situation where the science is changing, will continue to change. And so how we interact with the agency and this standard will be, it will unfortunately be interesting and not in a good way, but that's just my personal opinion. Okay, so let's talk about the medium hazardous employers, because I think this encompasses many of you. Kim, could you advance for me? So medium hazard, it's where you do expect to have more than just minimal contact with people within 6 feet, and probably not just incidental, but you know, for a few seconds, but for a longer period of time. And there are different sectors of the economy where the standard has suggested that you see this type of a situation. Manufacturing is one of them. You see a lot of retail type functions. Of course, the poultry, seafood, meat processing is in there. Manual labor. Kim, could you advance for me? Schools, construction, both indoors, outdoors, call centers, food banks. Kim, would you advance for me? You'll have a copy so that you can see this. It doesn't mean every single person in these work settings would be medium hazard. If you had clerical or administrative or executive staff or people who, I don't know, a driver or someone who does not come into contact with people much, then even if you fall within these industry sectors, that I think the agency would see that not necessarily as medium hazard. So sports venues, homeless shelters, your gyms, public transport, you name it. So Kim, would you advance? So when you have these types of situations, the agency is requiring you, when feasible, to telework, to stagger shifts, try to create distance or time separation between employees, the social distancing as a requirement, and maybe exploring ways to deliver services to customers or product through curbside delivery, pickup or delivery, maybe. And also, this is a big one for many of you. You have shared shared break rooms or cafeterias or you name it. And so the agency has some specifics in reconfiguring that so that you can have people socially distance. You can require that, you know, certain capacity, maximum capacity for these spaces so that they can realistically socially distance. Kim, would you advance for me? So additional requirements for medium hazard employers. Now, this is a big one, the infectious disease preparedness and response plan. And for medium-sized employers, there's an exemption to provide this if you have 10 or fewer employees. But everybody else, you have to put this into place. And so there are different components. Look to the agency website and ask Brett, ask me, ask any of us. And where a lot of the materials, the specifics are being developed by the agency. Last time I checked, it wasn't on the agency site, but they're making resources available to you. And so, but it's going to include components like your plan should require components like having a person who's designated to implement the plan. There should be some employee involvement, but that's a good best practice already. Hazard assessment of the job tasks and whether they're high or low or medium risk levels. The employees who may have a second or third job, are they exposed to hazard levels higher than yours somewhere else and then bringing that back. The individual risk factors of employees. Let's say you have someone who's asthmatic, someone who has high blood pressure, any of those. And you, I'm not saying go and ask everybody for their health conditions. Don't do that. There's ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act issues. There might be HIPAA. But to the extent that those employees make these conditions known to you, or if it's something that is made known to you, then having some kind of accommodations for that would be contemplated in the plan. Also, having contingency plans, and these, not necessarily everything in the standard is geared toward its stated purpose, which is COVID prevention. Most of it is, but some of it isn't. And so requiring companies to address absenteeism, personally, I think that's more of a business decision and not necessarily one that the agency should govern, but it's in there. There are cross-training and continued operation plans in case people are not able to work. That's actually supposed to be in your response plan to VOSH. There's enhanced workplace control measures. If you do have an outbreak, then what is your game plan to attack if your current controls are not halting an outbreak of the virus? And also just anticipating, okay, what if we have a break in the supply chain? What if we have delayed deliveries? How your going concern would continue to run. Kim, would you advance for me?
Courtney, before you go on, if you wouldn't mind, on the prior slide, there was a discussion about hazard assessment. Is there clarity as to what the protocol for doing a hazard assessment is?
Unfortunately, no. And I would be skeptical that the agency would get into enough detail to help give you the clarity you want. But this, again, personnel is policy. And so Brett, others will continue to provide feedback to the agency in terms of providing that clarity. I understand that VMA itself is going to jump into helping to provide that very actively for you. So by all means, try to use those resources. And again, I just tell folks, the watchword is safety. We don't have to abandon our good sense and our expertise as we try to address this. And I think the agency will work with us if we're doing that. But unfortunately, no, I don't see that clarity for you just yet. So other requirements for the medium hazard employers, there's pre-screening or surveying before work shifts. It may or may not include temperature taking. That is really your decision. And providing face coverings to visitors who have suspected cases before they come onto your work site. And the infection prevention. So there's the hand washing. There's not only cleaning, but also disinfecting. And when you're talking about disinfecting, the Environmental Protection Agency has what's called a List N. And it's a list of disinfectants that are known to be effective against COVID. And also, if you just check the labeling, if it's not on the List N, then something that is identified as effective against COVID would suffice. So, and also managing and educating your visitors. Many of you do that before they come into your work site. I think that's something that most of you have already begun to do. Kim, would you advance for me? So you have to identify and isolate any known cases or suspected cases of COVID. You have to address potential subcontractors, your temp employees, your contract employees, and other visitors. That has to be in your plan. You also have to have anti-retaliation protections for employees who raise concerns. And again, that's only up through management. They can go straight to the agency if they wish. The agency is asking employees to talk to your employer. That's a common sense question. Because, gee whiz, do they really have to add onto the big pile of complaints that the agency is getting? Why don't they just talk to the supervisor and see if they can work something out? So there's some reason that needs to be used here. So and there's also a requirement that you assess and require and communicate with respect to personal protective equipment use beyond the requirements in general industry. And that's, I read that to mean that you're addressing the hazards that are actually at your work site and not just what was contemplated in the old regs. Kim, would you advance for me? There are a lot of requirements, I'm sorry, but I did feel I had to add them in. You have to have a written certification to verify that you did your workplace hazard assessments with the date, with every work site that was evaluated. And also there's some requirements that your HVAC system follow manufacturer's instructions and then certain other standards as well. So Kim, would you advance for me again? Then there's the training, and this is a biggie, and it's coming up quick. And I wish I could provide more, but these are at least you have these bullet points to start with. And so you have to complete your training on COVID with your employees within 30 days after it has become effective. So we're talking really about by late August. And so on this, you have to train on the standard, you have to train on your plan. You should train on the CDC guidelines, and also, and most of you have trained on most of this, which is, what are the signs and the symptoms of COVID, and what are the risk factors if you have other health conditions? What you have to train on asymptomatic spread or spread before they show symptoms. What personal protective equipment would be appropriate? What are your safe practices? And also on their rights in terms of retaliation. And you're also expected to retrain, so that if there are gaps and people aren't getting it, the agency expects retraining to happen, or if the science or if situations change, that you continue to train to change, you continue to retrain to address hazards. So just have one more slide, Kim. And so just real briefly, I don't think this applies to many of you, but I did want to share the high hazard employers. And this is where you're talking about your first responders. If you're talking, so imagine a hospital. The folks in the emergency room will probably be your high hazard folks. The folks, someone who works in radiology on the other side of the hospital would not. So we're talking about the real high hazard, the first responder types, prisons, well, probably beyond prisons, really more like mortuaries, et cetera. So there are certain additional enhanced requirements. So in airborne infection isolation rooms, if you have patients with known or suspected cases, CDC requirements for handling specimens, post-mortem activities, so for these, there are additional requirements. There's even a requirement for psychological support for people in these highly stressful situations, and a respiratory protection program that addresses the hazards of that particular workplace. So with that, Kim, I think we're down to my last one, and I'm glad to take any questions.
Yeah, so let's try to tackle some of the questions that we have in the chat. So I'm going to work through the chat. If I call on your question and you want to unmute your line to offer some clarity or follow up, then you can do that at this time. But let's take the question from Catherine. She said, is there a chart that notes which standards are more restrictive than the federal standards? I haven't seen anything, Courtney.
No, but it's a good suggestion. And if whoever raised it, raise it with the industry. Speak up, and if you have suggestions you'd like me to share with the agency for you, I'm glad to do that. It really should it should make this as easy as possible, because this is 35 pages of complication that it got rushed through, and so they need to put in overtime to make this workable for you.
Okay, awesome. We have another question. I'm not sure who this is from. Do we report positive tests if they are infected elsewhere, or only if they're exposed at the facility?
Yeah, so my initial answer is good luck figuring out which of those two scenarios you're dealing with. Who knows where you catch it? Did you catch it at a restaurant? Did you catch it from a family member, a cousin, work? Who knows? But this standard does not make that work-related requirement a part of it. And so we are reporting COVID cases to Department of Health if you have a case, and then to Department of Labor and Industry if you have 3 or more within a 2-week period. And that's whether they're work-related or not. that's the plain language of the standard.
Question from Daryl. Is the employer responsible for reporting cases of contractors or subcontractors, or are they responsible for their own reporting?
You're responsible for your own reporting. This standard does not contradict that requirement for reporting before this standard. There's no additional language to put that on, say, a general contractor or a prime subcontractor. I would, as a best practice, include in your contracts with your subs and your trades that they are doing their own reporting, they're doing their own OSHA compliance, and as a best practice, I would do some follow-up with them to make sure they're doing that, because the agency is not always so precise in delineating between general contractors and subs. And they have a tendency to, sometimes, surprise, surprise, the agency will kind of use scattershot and hit everybody they see and then see what sticks.
All right, great. We've already tackled the double reporting question. Is VOSH the enforcement entity, or do local health departments remain enforcers?
VOSH is the enforcer of this standard.
Okay. And then could you describe what's involved in conducting a hazard assessment?
So one thing I would do, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the agency website as well, is to see what it's putting together in terms of some templates, some checklists, some guidance, so that if you kind of stay within that, then you should be fine. And so, hopefully that will make life a lot easier for you. They just really need to kind of step it up and get that out there for everybody. And once they do, then I think it'll become more clear.
Hey, Courtney, this was Russell. That was my question. One of the things that concerns me is their terminology. I'm not so sure it's a hazard assessment, but more of a risk assessment. Am I correct?
Tell me what you're thinking on that.
Well, a hazard assessment, in this case, the hazard is the infectious microorganism. And frankly, so you don't really need to identify what the hazard is. The hazard is an infectious microorganism. It's the pathways and the exposure ways that you're conducting, let's say, this survey about. So you have, and basically the receptor is people. So the pathways to exposure is what you're really assessing, not necessarily the hazardous. A hazard assessment would be is whether you die from it, or you go to the hospital, or you just get a cold. That's a hazard. The hazards are pretty well, that's sort of the identification of the morbidities and so on associated with the disease. That's why I think the standard misrepresents what they're really asking. But that's different, you know, we can debate that.
No, kudos to you. You're using more precise language, and I do agree with you. Unfortunately, it really was rushed through and without much by way of input. And I can't claim that I was perfect in this process. And I will tell you that it was a very flawed process, and I would have benefited from having more meaningful and input from stakeholders on this. But that's a great point. That's correct.
Do face covering exemptions still apply for those with conditions that prevent them from wearing one if social distancing isn't possible when we have two or more of these folks? What are the options?
Would you repeat again? Would you repeat it? I want to make sure I have it right.
Yeah, Lisa, can you unmute your line and ask your question? It's about face coverings. Do face covering exemptions still apply for those with conditions that prevent them from wearing one?
Yes, if it introduces a greater hazard, then yes. So, for example, in a very hot situation where heat exposure may be a concern, or if they have a condition such that they can't wear the face covering, then yes, they are exempted. Also, there are exemptions for religious purposes. But if you do have one, and let's say a respirator is required, then then there's an exemption that would apply, but you could probably get a loose fitting respirator that would cover, if you, for example, someone who had to wear facial hair as a religious practice, you could probably get a loose fitting one that would still provide the same protection.
Okay.
Hey, Courtney, this is Rob with Volvo. We're offering face shields as an alternative for folks who can't wear a mask. So,
if I could comment, so this is my understanding, is that they provide different types of protection. And so the cloth face coverings that are contemplated here, and they often say surgical masks, but I take that to mean that cloth face coverings, which are very similar. They're not, of course, personal protective equipment, but they're intended to prevent the spread of the aerosol virus outward. And so at least my understanding from the science is that while face shields may prevent some, that it's less effective than the cloth face coverings, in that it's really more, as I understand, intended more as a splash guard and protection for the eyes for anything coming in, but is not as effective as what you're breathing out, because it kind of comes out from under and around the mask or the face shield to others. But that's my understanding, and the science is developing, and that's just simply what I've noticed. And I think that, and I will tell you that I think that question has come up to me and to clients, and it seems that the advice that I've been giving is that, and I think a lot of people, especially if for whatever reason, younger workers like the face shields better, but I think based on the CDC guidance and OSHA guidance, that was not viewed as having the same level of protection to others in terms of what you breathe out. Does that make sense?
Is there any guidance on selecting PPE for medium risk job tasks?
Guidance for medium risk. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot out there. The industry is very good. This is where industry, so OSHA, I can't say it otherwise. They're the Johnny-come-latelys of guidance. It's very Me Too. It's 2 or 3 months after everyone's kind of embraced the practice. I can't sugarcoat that one. OSHA's guidance comes out it's $1 late and way too, $1 short and a day late, or months. But CDC's been better at this, and so there's some guidance. There's some industry-based guidance that has come out from OSHA and CDC. I think the better guidance comes out from industry. National Association of Manufacturing, VMA, your trade associations, your safety professionals. I think they're much more on point, and CDC is in the mix, but I think more specific guidance for your place of employment, if you're a medium, I think you're going to find it from your trade associations.
And then Addis had a question. If you have multiple locations, do you have to report positive cases to all locations or just employees at that location?
So the way I read this is that it would be employees at that location. And so, and that was the previous guidance. I don't see this contradicting that, but it does merit a closer look. But so the rule before was that you go to, under the previous guidance, federal guidance, you go to those to whom that employee may have been exposed, but close in time and place, that kind of thing. Not contract tracing necessarily, but just, and you're not revealing the name of the employee who had the test, obviously. That's a big no-no. So now we have layered on top of this a requirement. So we have the business owner requirement, but you're not asking about a business owner, you're asking about an employer with multiple locations. The answer to me would still be no. You stick with that location and people who may have been exposed to that individual. And it makes sense. If the agency gets super regulatory on that I can't imagine they would go that far. It just wouldn't make any sense. If it was a trucker who went for, or someone who commuted from work site to work site, that would make a lot more sense. But if it just makes no sense. And I can't imagine the standard, the way I read it, and given the backdrop of the guidance that it came from, that it would be viewed otherwise.
Hey, I think that question was from somebody prior. So this is Addis. My question was one below it, the 24-hour notification. Is that truly like 24 hours business? So say we get a report Friday evening. I mean, are we trying to put this thing out there to employees who may be going home for the weekend? Or do we have Monday? And then along with that would be, we personally try to reach out to the close contacts first. And if we don't get the close contacts, we're really focusing on that more than just trying to put out the general, hey, we had a case in the plant. Does that come into play at all?
Yeah. So 24 hours is 24 hours on this, your clock, your watch. It's not business time. It's on your clock. So once you get the notice of the positive test, the clock ticks, and you have 20, and then you have to go ahead and report. Can you repeat the second question? I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand it.
So we're talking about a 24-hour notification to employees that we have a positive case, and I mean that's complicated, to especially if employees have already gone home.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I meant by the 24-hour. How do you do that if, let's say, a team has already gone home for the day and won't be back till Monday? That's the hours. And then, whether or not in that 24 hours, we're trying to contact the close contacts first to let them know that they have personally come in contact with somebody, monitor their conditions, et cetera, before we go out to the whole plant and say, okay, we've had a positive case, which is that 24-hour notification, right?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. So I was talking about reporting it to the agency, and you're talking about reporting it to coworkers. I don't know that off the cuff. Let me look at that, and can we talk offline?
Absolutely. I reached out through the texting. I would like to email you some information I have on another subject.
Sure, absolutely.
Addis, I will put the two of you in contact after the meeting. So I want to be respectful. I want to be respectful of folks' time, and we are at the end of our hour. We can certainly stay on. I know you guys have questions, Courtney. If your schedule will allow a little bit of extra time so people can ask questions.
Sure.
Okay, great. And you've already alluded to this, but the VMA, we're working to put a workshop together on disease prevention, also some online training, and a final a certification package that will be available the first week in August. So we will send folks information on that. We know you guys, several of you have some very complicated situations that you'll need to work through. So we have some consultants, and then certainly Courtney is available to help us as well. So let's get back to the questions that we have in chat. And for those of you who need to drop off for other meetings, thanks so much for dialing in today. We appreciate it. We'll have all the presentation and the recording for today's meeting out on our website, and we will send it out to everyone as well. So we've already we addressed the 24-hour notification piece. It says, are hazard assessments required to be conducted for all job activities or just medium and high activities?
Oh, yeah. So you do, that's a requirement for all.
Okay.
Everyone has to do job, task assessment, hazard assessment.
Is there an indication that if a facility reports 3 or more cases in a 2-week period, that the facility will be subject to a for-cause inspection?
A for-cause inspection. And I guess that, so I think, yeah, I think you mean a inspection arising from a report. And so let's just say I've never known someone to go to the refrigerator unless they intend to eat. And I think that if the agency requests this reported information, that it will use this for enhanced enforcement activity. So far, it's been enforcing by fax and phone. And so I do think that the way the standard will be enforced will differ from what we've been seeing so far. And I think that those hotspots, if they, as I would call them, and maybe you might disagree because actually if you have thousands of people, 3 is pretty low. But I think that the agency will use that data for enhanced enforcement activity.
Once training's been conducted within a company, who or what method do we report its completion?
You will have your training information on hand, and then you don't. As I recall, there was not a requirement that you submitted, but simply that you have it. And I have to go back and make sure of that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it said. And so, but do me a favor and have it done, documented. And when you do, especially when you do your trainings, have a sign-up sheet. Have everyone sign in, staple it to the curriculum, and put it in an organized file, maybe chronologically, by subject, however, and then have that in a file ready to go. So that if and when we do have to deal with an inspection, we can pull that out, show them we're organized, we have our stuff together, here's the training, here's the retraining, and here are these employees who called in the complaint, and guess what, they took the training too, so that we can make a clear-cut case and get the agency moving along to somebody else.
If you have a positive case in another state, do you have to report to the Virginia location employees?
No.
The plan. So while the plan is required to be finished for 60 days from the effective date, they want training on the plan to occur within 30 days.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes. So in other words, the plan needs to be finished within 10 to 15 days so you can get all your training done by the 30 days?
I wish it was drawn another way. That's how I read it. And the only reasonable reading of it that I can gather from this is that I just can't. There are problems with the document. It was rushed. They needed input.
Definitely not complaining. Just wanted to confirm, not complaining to you rather, but just wanted to confirm that that's the case, that basically the plans need to be finished very quickly so that all training can be completed within 50 days of the effective date.
My only hope is that they're reasonable in how they enforce it.
Can you take credit for training that's already been completed? Or does this the clock with new training?
I would use the training that you provided and then supplement it with the additional requirements.
That may make it a little easier.
Yeah. I would hope that folks in the agency would have, I'll be straight, the sense to not cite for not training on something that's not yet written and not required to be written. And maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. But I'll go back and look at that again. But that's how I read it.
Courtney, employees that are going out of town for vacation, how should it be handled when they return to work?
Yeah. So, well, impossibility is always a defense against a citation. And so if it's impossible to comply, then that's a defense. I would hope the agency would not require us to lay out the elements of impossibility, but just say, look, you know what, we trained them. We trained them when they got back within a reasonable time frame.
Hey, to add on to that one, the way I read that question was, if I have an employee who's on vacation and it could be one of the states that's got an increase, are there any rules or regulations that I have to tell them to self-quarantine before allowing them to return to the office?
Yeah, so there are return to work. Well, okay, that's a different provision if you have COVID. So they're in your infectious disease control plan. You do have to contemplate introduction of hazards of folks, and that includes if they've come from places where it's a COVID hotspot. That is included within your plan. And so most of us, I think, are, if not all of us, are asking questions like, among our questions, and these are among the CDC questions, have you, what was, about your travel, recent travel, and where you've been before you come back to the work site. So I would expect that your plan would incorporate, and that your screening of employees before they return to work would incorporate those same types of questions.
Diane, you have a question around training being in person or online. If you want to unmute your line and ask your question directly, you can do that at this time.
Sure. So my question is, Can we do a PowerPoint presentation and we have our employees look at it? I'm not.
Yeah, and just to help folks who may not have heard, can it be done online and through a PowerPoint presentation? And so the requirement does not have any requirements of in-person training, and so that should be fine. And yeah, so yeah, there's no prohibition against doing it online.
All right, do we have any other questions for Courtney? So if we don't have any more questions, then I will turn it over to Brett and he can close us out.
Hey, Courtney, I had a question on his statement on travel. I'm trying to understand what is the state's requirement. I know some states going to hotspots are requiring a 14-day, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey. What is Virginia doing? So what is the guidance to us? Otherwise, how can we legally prevent people from coming back to work if they went to a hotspot and are not showing symptoms?
Unfortunately, the standard is not at all specific on that, and there is no specific guidance on that, not from the state agency, not from this standard. So the only guidance that we have to go on is what we have been getting from federal OSHA and from the CDC, but really effectively from the CDC. And so the guidance that we've been going with in terms of, the standard really just addresses screenings before someone would come in back into the workplace. But no, it doesn't provide the specifics that you're asking for from the state.
Hey, Courtney, is sending a text or email sufficient for notifying employees?
It doesn't say. I would caution against a text unless you get a response, and text messaging I find is just not a great way to communicate, and especially specifics and sensitive information. If you don't have another way, then I would go by email, but I would try to get at least some kind of confirmation of receipt, and perhaps I would even suggest asking the employee to call you so that you can convey that information.
Courtney, that was my question. I mean, if we have 150 people in an office location, we're expected to make a phone call to all of them at this point?
So that's a good question. I'm dealing with someone who's dealing with a similar situation, and they are actually putting something out. Generally, I've had 2 of those situations so far, and they put out general email messages out to all employees or to large groupings of employees. So that would suffice. You may, depending on how you're set up and how segregated they are in space and time, you may consider targeting it to the people who worked on their shift, work in the area, people who you have strong reason to believe that they were in close contact with. But you can also do a scattershot. I'm sorry, I don't mean to mischaracterize here, but you can do a broader communication by email if you wish. And I've worked with employers who do that as well.
Brittany, you said that you look at the CDC for determinations about hotspots. At least that's what I understood you to say. Where specifically have you seen a definition of a hotspot?
Oh, it doesn't not. I'm sorry. Hotspot was a word that I just kind of used, especially with the new 3 or more COVID positive tests to report to the agency here in Virginia. So no, it doesn't have terminology like that.
I'm sorry. In terms of the travel and screening for travel. So, has a CDC come out with some sort of statement that if you have X% infection rate or per capita, that means that area is a, generally speaking, a hotspot? Or should we just rely on whether the governor puts quarantine measures in for people coming in from other areas?
Yeah, I think we can use what the governor is putting out. And so I haven't looked at the CDC, and I don't imagine it's changed much. I have not looked at the CDC guidance in a little bit, so I'd have to kind of go back and see what they're doing. But generally, the employers are asking, have you traveled, and what your travel has been, and have you traveled? And if so, then oftentimes they've gone into a little bit more of a detailed inquiry about it. So, but I can go back with you and look and see what is out there right now. It's just been a little while since I've looked at that.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much, Courtney, and thanks for staying on for over our allotted time and answering questions. We appreciate that. Brett, I'm going to turn it over to you just to kind of close us out quickly.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Courtney. I hope folks got some good information. Again, there are going to be many, many questions. What I did want to let you all know, we have already communicated with the Department of Labor and Industry because they chose to bar public participation in the hearings. Many of these things could have been addressed through the hearing process, but they chose to do it the hard way. So there's going to end up being an FAQ developed. The FAQ is going to answer some of the implementation questions or address some of the issues that are silent, if you will, in the emergency standard. I'll give you one example. The VMA made public comment that they had two different definitions in the draft rule, the draft standard of hand sanitizer. They also had a requirement that you provide hand sanitizer and hand washing stations. We suggested that they clarify what they mean by hand sanitizer and not restrict the definition so tightly, because we have FDA facilities that don't allow alcohol-based hand sanitizer in their facility. And then second, it was overkill to have both, and sometimes just not possible. So within 24 hours of the final rule passing, we had to come back to the agency and we said, now you've created a hazard. Because if you require hand sanitizer based on 60% alcohol, you've now created a situation that is either a volatile situation in some facilities, or it creates an FDA non-compliance for some of our pharmaceutical facilities. And their immediate response was, well, then, we're not really sure how to deal with it. And we came to the conclusion that they would issue some sort of guidance as an FAQ document, and they would specifically outline some of those problems where either the standard is unclear or the standard is in conflict with other sections of OSHA guidance or FDA or other. So I wanted you to be aware that anything that you identify in the final rule that is unclear, please send us a note on that, and we're going to be submitting on a weekly basis those things and trying to get guidance issued officially from the agency that clarifies it. That way you're not in what I've dubbed this entire emergency standard to be as a litigation trap. It really is going to be a litigation trap because it'll be impossible for some employers to comply with the deadlines for training in the time period, and it exposes the company to some risk from suit. It also, some of the standards is just unclear what is economically feasible versus what is practical. And it's going to be in the eye of the beholder, and who is that determination, and when does that determination take place, before or after court. So I tell you all this because my closing comment for you all is that since the VMA has been working on this since its very first introduction that we learned several weeks ago, and we worked through the process with Courtney and others, we have tasked our Manufacturing Skills Institute. Many of you may not be aware, we have an affiliate organization that does training and consulting for manufacturers in 19 states and trains several thousand people a year. Safety is one of its largest areas of concentration. So what we've done is we've put together a work team. They have developed a curriculum, and we now have an online training asset that is going to be available to every member company. It will be specific to this COVID standard, so that you will be able to offer that to your employees. And once they complete the certificate, and you can prove that you have met the standard for training of your workers. It'll be online entirely, and it comes with a learning management system where you can track the progress and the success of your employees working through those. It also is modular, and it is also available on desktops, laptops, and it'll be available through tablets. So it's web enabled, and it's mobile. So your employees don't have to have a computer to go through it. That's the goal. We've been working on this. It'll be available on our website by the first week in August. In addition, what we have matched with that, we have some members who have worked together, and we have developed a 3-hour training session to walk companies through the development of their disease prevention and mitigation plan. Some members are very versed in this, and all you're going to do is update your plan to comply once you understand the reg. We get that, but our estimate is the vast majority, well over 75% of the manufacturing sector, does not have a disease prevention plan and probably has never developed one. So we are going to have a template and a training workshop available for members in that first week in August as well. So, and then the third piece of this puzzle is something we developed well over 6 weeks ago and made it available for free to member companies, and that is the COVID action plan. And it is basically a how to prepare plan based upon the CDC and OSHA guidance. So we're going to update that, make that available as a resource, a free resource, that one. And then finally, we do have 4 courses that are available today on COVID pandemic preparation that are also mobile enabled, and you can provide those to your employees. Every member company will get 4 of those modules distributed to them this week free, and you can build that into your own training program if you choose not to participate or you don't need the certification. So the idea is that you'll have the disease prevention plan through the workshop with a template. You'll have consultants at your disposal. We have 2 right now on retainer that are going to work with member companies, and you can use them through your own arrangement with them. So you'll have the disease prevention plan completed through the workshop. Then you'll have the training that'll be available to your employees, and you will get the certification in case you're ever challenged, and use that as part of your compliance documentation. And then once all of that is completed, you will actually get a certification, and it's basically going to be part of Manufacturing Makes Virginia Safer, and the pledge that we issued a couple of months ago that participating sites are now posting to their social media and front doors and to communicate to their employees and public their commitment to safety. This will be an extension of that, a really extensive extension, but it'll be an extension of that so that you're sure that you're in compliance with the state standard. Let me also pause here for a moment and switch gears to forward-looking statement. This is a 6-month standard, and I think we've addressed that. The reality is we are convinced that the board will reconvene before the 6-month mark and consider a permanent standard. If they do not convene before the Virginia General Assembly session, we are equally convinced that the administration will likely introduce a bill that mirrors this final emergency standard, and they'll try to codify it. This is something we've seen them do before in other areas. There's no reason to not expect them to try to do it. And in this political environment, we also believe that they will vote it out on a party line basis over the objections of industry. So we have to get this training certification. We have to get this disease prevention plan training and all of it together. We have to get it done and get it done right for member companies, because I don't think we can take a chance this is just temporary. I think we're going to be at this a while. And as I said before, I think it's a litigation trap for bigger companies with the trial bar and organized labor. And we're going to do our best to make sure all of this is ready for you all. So that's where we're at, and I'll answer any questions I can, but we're way over time. We know that, and but please feel free to email or just pick up the phone and call us, and we'll answer any questions we can. And finally, I know that Courtney is too much of a gentleman to mention this, but I will for him. He is our legal counsel, and he's done a tremendous amount of work. But don't forget that if you do get yourself in a situation where you do need legal help, or you need a legal review of what you're preparing, please feel free to contact Courtney and his firm. They do amazing work, and they have done a lot of pro bono work for us so far, and I think that they'll do a great job as legal counsel for you all if you need it. So please don't forget, pick up the phone and call Courtney if you need help. His firm is available to be available to you all. So, Courtney, thanks again. Thank you to everybody on the call. If we don't have anything else, Kimberly, then I'll just end it there.
We're done. Thank you.
All right.
You guys have a great day.
Our best to your wife, Brett.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.